Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Welcome back. Today I've got a fun mosaic project, which I've been kind of toying with ever since I went to Barcelona early last year. I fell in love with all the mosaics on the buildings and in the park that were designed by the famous architect Gaudi. So when I came back to the US, I started exploring mosaics more, did a lot of internet searching, and I came across these really cool mosaic boxes, which I want to show you. I like to talk a little bit about my design inspiration because people sometimes ask. And so I came across these really cool mosaic boxes that are designed by the artist Francis Green, and I thought, hey, I think through a combination of fun applique work, both made out of royal icing and cookies, applied to cookies, I could recreate this box entirely in cookie form. So this is the project for today. It's a 3D cookie mosaic box, and I'm going to break this video into two parts. We'll start first with the bottom, and then we'll move on to the lid in part two. I'm not going to do the box square. I'm going to do it in a round shape just because I think it's kind of a softer, cool shape. But I am going to try to design it such that the patterns sort of work from bottom on up and that they connect much in the way that they do on this box. We're also going to be doing this fun little topper knob when we get to the lid. I'm also going to brighten it up a bit because some of you have been asking for brighter colors. So that's where we're headed. This is a pretty complicated, I shouldn't say complicated project, but time-consuming project insofar as it involves a lot of piecework. I think I counted about probably close to 200 to 300 small little pieces applied to the bottom of this box. So if you want to abbreviate this project, you could consider doing it on a flat cookie, applying the same techniques to a flat cookie, or just doing the bottom and not the lid, for instance. So there are various ways to shortcut it, or doing a smaller box, as we're going to do today. Okay, so to the pieces. This is really a 3-cookie project for the bottom. I'm working with a fluted round for the base. This is about 5 inches across, and it was cut with this copper cutter from coppergifts.com, one of my favorite cookie cutter suppliers. And then it requires 2 sides that we're going to piece together. These contoured sides. I have a whole video on how to contour cookie dough, but let me touch briefly on how I created that shape. Basically, I roll out my dough, and here I'm working with my gingerbread recipe into a strip. This strip is maybe about 4 or 5 inches long, and it's about 2.5 inches tall. Most of these boxes I did either 2.5 or 2 inches tall. I form it over a round. You can use a tin can. I've used a cake form here. I set it in another pan, stick it in the oven, and bake it. When it's slightly cool, it'll pop off and become a shape similar to this and the ones I have in front of me. So that's the first thing. You want to bake all the pieces, cool them down, and then you want to prepare them for assembly. I am actually going to spray these gingerbread pieces so that they look, with a pearl spray, so that they look kind of shiny and white behind the mosaic because I don't want the dark showing through. This is an optional step. But before we spray, it's advisable to actually make sure all your pieces are nicely fitting and tight, because if you spray and then come back and pare them and file them, you can leave fingerprints on this spraying and they'll look kind of messed up. So we're going to start first by filing everything. When these contoured pieces come off the round, they can sometimes have uneven or rough edges, and those are edges you want to file down. I've already nicely filed this one. So it's a nice fit on top of the round, and you can see it looks nice and circular from top down as well. That's what I'm looking to achieve. I usually start by doing paring motions to really knock it down. Oftentimes I may have to cut off 1 inch to 1/2 an inch because these are more than semicircular. They're a little bit more than half of the circle, so I'm cutting down quite a lot so that they meet about halfway. So I'll start with big broad strokes with my paring knife, like so, shaving more than cutting so I don't break the dough. And you'll see the dough is quite crunchy. That's the nature of my dough, but I also bake it a little longer when I do these contoured pieces so it's a little bit more rigid. Then for finer filing, I can use my microplaner to make sure it's straight up and down. This is a food-safe tool. If you're using or planning to use these cookies largely for display and not eating them, you can cheat and use a piece of sanding paper also to kind of sand the edge, much like this. So there are different ways you can do it. This is a little more efficient, but then again, it's not food safe, so just beware. And so when you're done with all the filing, you should have a box that fits neatly together. Okay, I'm all set up to spray these pieces. I've got a backdrop set up, and I've covered my whole surface with parchment paper. This spray, I'm working with a PME brand luster spray, and there are various other brands, but it does get very airborne. So if you have a hood, it's a good idea to work under that. So be careful and protect your work surfaces because this can sometimes be a little bit of a bear to clean up. Completely edible though. Start by shaking it well. And it tends to spray better when it's upright, but I've got to get down to get some sides of these pieces, so I may be going a little bit sideways with the spray can. We'll see how it works. I do like to elevate pieces off the ground, which allows me a little bit better access to the parts that are towards the bottom. These are the contoured pieces, so I've got it elevated on a little box. Just test it before I begin, and then just spray 4 or 5 inches away from the surface. I like to use a rotating motion. Seems to go down a little more smoothly. We'll get the other one sprayed, and then we'll start assembly. I often let the first coat of spray dry a little bit, and it dries within minutes or seconds, but I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to set this aside and continue with assembly. So I'm cleaned up from spraying, and I'm ready to put these pieces together. I like to work on a little bit of cardboard so that if this needs some drying time, I can easily put it off to the side, and I'm never having to handle the actual piece that I'm working with. Now, I also often choose a front side and a back side, and usually my front side is the piece that's slightly bigger or slightly longer. So in this case, it's going to be this side. And I do that so that if I'm viewing the box from the front, the seam will ultimately be covered with mosaic, but if for some reason the seam isn't so neatly covered, this way it always looks good from the front. Okay, so just to put it together, I'm working with royal icing of my glue consistency, very, very thick, because the thicker the icing is, the faster it dries. And had I sprayed the inside of this box with the pearl spray, I probably would use a white glue. It'd be less likely to show, but I didn't. It's brown inside, so I'm going to use brown. I usually do line these boxes with a little bit of paper, tissue paper, before I fill them with anything. So the seam and the color of the glue is less likely to, it's not going to show much anyway. So I get it positioned, and I'm looking at it both from the side to make sure it's equidistant front to back, and also directly overhead. And once I get it where I want it, I just apply a healthy dose of glue at the bottom. I tend to avoid putting it directly on the bottom of the contoured piece, just because it may poke out through the front, and I don't want to see that. And I'll also run it up the side seam and press it together. So that's what it looks like. I do tend to neaten that up by taking a clean finger and just pressing it into the seam. This helps to make sure it makes full contact with all the cookies. And with that together, I would set it aside to dry maybe for half an hour to an hour. I like the pieces to be fairly firmly in place before I start sticking mosaics on them, because there's less likelihood of those pieces sliding around. So that the mosaic lies really flat, I sometimes fill the seam on the front with icing. This was a brown icing that I used as well to fill the seam. I went ahead and sprayed over it again after filling that seam so that it'll appear silver as well, or pearl as well. That way when I lay the mosaic down, there'll be no brown poking through. You might ask, how do you go about coming up with a design? This one's pretty wild and crazy, and that was kind of the idea. You could sketch something out and transfer your design somehow to the sides of these boxes by drawing it on. But in practical experience, I find that no matter how well I draw the design flat on the table, things always change when I get it up on the sides of the boxes. There's some irregularity to the contours of the cookie, some irregularity to each of the individual pieces we're putting on. So even if I draw it out nicely, it's not always going to translate exactly one for one. But what I do like to do is roughly draw out kind of the pattern I'm going to do so that I have a roadmap before I'm going to go. And I will have this downloadable on my website so you can look at it. Basically, for this box up here and for the one that I'm going to continue, I made it simple on myself by having one pattern that I replicate twice on the sides of the boxes. And it uses 4 different types of appliques, as I talked about. Fondant appliques, stamped fondant appliques, which are the bigger pieces. Just as an example of that, here's a stamped fondant applique with that very intricate black design. And that takes up a lot of space, and that helps make the design process go a little bit faster. Then I've got 2-dimensional royal icing transfers, which are these white pieces, the blue pieces, the pink pieces, and the black pieces. I have a whole video about how to do those. Then I've got some three-dimensional transfers, three-dimensional royal icing roses, which you can pipe. I'm going to create a whole nother video on that. These particular little bitty roses were actually bought at fancyflowers.com. And then I've got embossed cookie appliques that stand out even a little bit further from the box, these little silver pieces, which I have a whole another video that I'm going to be doing about how to emboss cookies and how to give them that sheen. So jump on over to that to see how those were done. They each get applied slightly different ways. Basically, the 3D appliques and the 2D royal icing transfers will get glued on with a thick royal icing glue because they're a little bit heavier and they need something to hold them fast to the sides of the boxes. Whereas the thin fondant appliques, I like to apply with corn syrup because the thick icing can be a little bit lumpy behind them and will be easily seen. Okay, so I've got my pasta machine set up for the fondant appliques. I roll the fondant appliques out one at a time as I use them and apply them to the box because they need to be soft and pliable in order to conform to the contoured sides. If you allow them to air dry, they will get brittle and be less able to do that. So, as I said, you could roll out with a rolling pin, but I think I get a finer, more uniform roll when I work with my pasta machine. And I'll start by guiding it through. This is kind of how I do my ribbon work for fondants. I'll start by guiding it through on the most open setting, which is 1 on my machine. And then for this particular application, I'm going to take it down to 3, which is maybe about 1/8 inch thickness. And then we're going to stamp that to get the pattern on. You could paint on fondant. You can do all different types of things, but stamping is a neat way to add quick detail. If the fondant's very, very soft and tacky, I do like to let it dry a little bit before I stamp it. Otherwise, the stamp will actually stick in the fondant. You might allow a couple of minutes for that. I'm dusting it with a little bit of powdered sugar to hopefully have the same effect. And I'm stamping with nothing more than food coloring. I have a whole nother stamping video for stamping on cookies, and this is the same process. I'm inking what was an uninked foam pad with a little bit of my liquid gel food coloring, blotting off the excess, and taking this lacy stamp and just inking it like so, checking the bottom to make sure I've got an even application of food coloring. And I'm going to have kind of a swoop of this lace coming up the side. So I'm going to position it this way, leaving some white to the left because I want some of the white also to be part of the applique. And hopefully this won't stick too much. There, that worked well. We need to now cut this down to fit the box. I've got a long, big strip of unused fondant that I want to save. And now I'm going to resituate myself. So I'm seated very low with the box elevated because I'm going to start applying things to the side, and it helps me to have the box eye level. And I'll show you how I fit this piece to the box, and we'll start putting on all the other pieces. I've got one of those fondant appliques. In keeping with the design up there that I'm mimicking, I just want to cut kind of a sweep through here. So I'm going to take a cutter to just give that a little more of a curvy shape. I'm noticing that my food coloring is still a little damp on top, so you just want to be careful about pressing too hard on it because you might smudge it. Now to stick down fondant appliques, I like to work with corn syrup, as I said before, because thick royal icing can be a little too lumpy. So I'm just taking a little bit, just needs to be tacky, and dabbing it on the back of the applique with a little paintbrush. Don't want it wet, just tacky. And it's going to sweep kind of like so on up the side. This is why I like to have the box elevated. I'm going to let the extra fall to the inside of the box. I'll show you in a second how I trim that up so I get a nice neat edge at the top. And I'm kind of avoiding pressing on the food coloring right now for fear of smudging it. You could let the applique dry a touch longer before putting it down. And then I just want to make sure that it's fully flush to all sides. Okay, don't want it sticking up at the top there, wrapping over the top, because when I try to put the lid down later, in part 2 we're going to be doing the lid, that'll interfere with the closing of the lid. So to get a nice straight cut, I take my pizza wheel. You can use a paring knife, but I find this is a nice way to just trim out the top edge. I'm holding the box as I do that so it doesn't slide off my little platform here. And then I can just take that away. It's a nice, nice cut. The first piece I'm going to put down is my big embossed cookie piece. This is the second type of transfer. It's an embossed cookie with a turquoise colored royal icing transfer in the middle. And I'll show how to emboss those cookies in another video. I'm going to put that down here in the low spot. So just applying it kind of generously to the back and then sticking it right where I want it, pressing gently. And you'll see how thick the icing glue is. A heavy piece like that will stay put pretty quickly. I do like to apply these while this fondant is still somewhat soft, because I'll be sticking the pieces up next to it. If you allow this to dry overnight, it'll get really rigid and crunchy, and sometimes it's a little harder to get the pieces down next to it. Wherever there are holes, I'll fill in with little small transfers. So I'm gonna put a little pink bead there. So it's just a process basically of gluing and sticking. The next thing that's gonna go up is a 3D royal icing transfer, and I'll have another video at some future point about how to make these little bitty roses and other larger size roses. I'm just shaving down the back side with my scissors, and you could also file that on a microplaner, just so again it sits a little more flush to my box. That's entirely optional. And I move things around. You know, I do have some latitude before the icing dries to move things around to ensure good fit. So now I'm going to flank the rest of that strip with the black beads, and I'm going to come up the side with a bunch of black beads. Okay, so I'm down to the end of the sweep, and you might ask, well, how do you fill really small, tiny little places like that? You could cut out a little bit of fondant and stick it in there. Oftentimes, I'll take a different shaped bead, like this oval might fit nicely in there. Or you can even take a round piece and sand it down using either your microplaner or a little piece of sanding paper if you're not going to eat the box, and just file down the sides so that you have a slightly smaller piece to fit into those tiny little pieces. So here's an example of a filed down half round. I think though, I am going to try to fit the oval in there. And you'll notice I'm always holding the inside of the box slightly as I press the bead in so that I don't push my box off the surface, and cleaning up extra icing before it dries with my trussing needle. Okay, now I'm going to flip over to this side. I have some irregular pieces that might be harder to fill with my very regular beads and things. So I am going to cut up a little bit of fondant. I'm going to show you how to cut up some of the fondant we stamped earlier to create little tiles that can go into those pieces. So this is really yet another type of transfer. You know, there are myriad types of transfers. I'm only talking about 4 or 5 here. You know, another possibility is to pipe a big broad sheet of royal icing, let it dry, and then literally break it, crack it as you would glass in doing a real mosaic. And that creates a really cool effect too. You could use isomalt pieces, which are sugar pieces, to create a little sheen, all sorts of things. I'm just going to start by randomly kind of cutting up the sheet here. In doing these tile pieces to fit, it's nice to have a slightly firmer fondant, still pliable, but still somewhat firm, so that you can handle it without smushing it, because we are going to be handling it quite a bit. I'm going to put a little piece here. So I usually cut a bigger piece, bring it up to the box, kind of size it, and I'm going to just cut right through there to create a piece that fills that little corner. And I'll continue until I fill out that entire area. So we're back to corn syrup here because we're working with a thin fondant piece. So I just put a little smear on the back, and then I'm going to fit it into place. And even though I cut this on the surface thinking I got it where I needed it, it's a little bit tall. I can take a paring knife or my pizza wheel cutter and just trim that to the top edge. And then I'd continue in that vein, filling out these other areas. Here I've got to go around a round. So in this case, I'd take a little round cutter. I'm going to cut a little round area out, which will hopefully fit around that. Yeah, I think that does pretty well. We'll trim all the funny little extra pieces off when I get it up there. I like to leave a little bit of space between these so you can see that they're distinct tiles, and I'm going to use my trussing needle to wrap that around a little bit more. And when that's positioned where I want it, I will go ahead and trim the top edge. So that's the general method of applying different appliques. Basically a thick, heavy royal icing for larger three-dimensional appliques and royal icing transfers, and a thin corn syrup for sheets of fondant. So what's next? You could leave it like this, but I'm kind of a more is more person, so I'm going to put some little feet, little royal icing appliques down here as accent on these little feet. So I've got a slightly larger version of the black transfers that I used up the sides that I'm going to put all the way around here. These are about 3/8 of an inch. And again, my royal icing transfer video will show you exactly how I make transfers to the size that I want. I'm sticking these down with my thick icing glue. I'm going to go all the way around, and then I'm going to add a little bit of dot detail just to finish it off, because some people say everything's better with butter. I think every cookie's better with little beadwork on it. I always find it safer, especially when piping with black, because black is hard to remove if you mess up, to start in a least conspicuous zone. So I'm going to start on my back of the box, which isn't quite yet finished, rather than my front. My front was facing forward before. Here I'm working with royal icing of beadwork consistency, which forms a nice little dot on its own. It's relatively loose, and I have all my consistency adjustments on my site. And I am just going to put a series of dots here around the edge of this fondant applique, just to give you a sense of how to do that. And I'm barely pressing here because I don't want them to bleed together. My icing's relatively loose. Piping as perpendicular to the surface as I can so that they appear as dots as opposed to ovals. Nice set of dots there. And I'm going to do some down the sweep here. Again, very careful. And there we have it. We'll move on to part 2 of the video, where I'll show how to make the contoured lid and how to design it so that the pattern continues from the bottom of the box all the way up to the top. Till then, live sweetly.